All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We have quite a packed portion this week.
Yes.
So I doubt we will cover everything in great detail.
What?
I know. But and really there's some as I was kind of reading through, I mean there's so much. There's so much. This is why we read the Torah every year, right? So maybe next year we'll get to a different part of it. We can focus on a different part of the portion. So I will tell you, we probably won't talk about the 10 words a whole lot. Like as far as we probably won't sit and dissect them. We can talk about them, but just in case you were coming saying, all right, we're gonna go line by line through the 10 words, we're not gonna do that. Though I think it would be fascinating. And that's the part of, Lori and I were talking on the way in. Dennis Prager does have a commentary on Deuteronomy. It is very good, so I was reading it this week. But his section on the 10 words is about 50 pages. And I did not, that part I did not have time to read this week. So, and he also has the same, as much or more in the Exodus commentary on the 10 words. So he has a lot to say about the 10 words, so go read Dennis Prager if you want an in-depth look into the 10 words, particularly from Jewish perspective. I will say I really enjoy a lot of things, and there's several things that he brings up that I want to talk about today. I will say, as I was reading through this commentary in particular, maybe more so than Genesis and Exodus, which I can't say that I've read cover to cover, but I've read probably the majority of both of them. But probably Deuteronomy more so than the others, and I think I know why. He does lean a bit more to Jewish tradition than some of the others, and he leans a bit more to one of the things that you have to, I bring this up just because I do think Dennis Prager is very good. Obviously, I've recommended his commentaries many times here. One of the things that we have to be careful of is he does lean a little bit to the side where kind of, so he has this really strong hold to monotheism, that God is the only God. However, he also holds to this really high value of morality and thinking that God judges people based on their level of ethical morality, whether or not they believe in God. And it's a little bit funny. And I don't want us to follow that rabbit all the way down the trail. I just am making this comment to make you aware that he kind of has this lens which is in some areas of Judaism a popular thought. Judaism, of course, has many different views, as much like Christianity on different things, but of that God wants, like one of the things that God wants most is for people to be good, and it's not so much about their particular faith in him, which is a funny thing. But he does lean that way, and it comes out several times in his commentary. So I just want to make you aware that you can kind of just don't let it catch you and distract you from the good that is there, but also don't feel like you need to follow him down that trail. And remember that Dennis Prager is a Jewish man who doesn't believe Yeshua is the Messiah. So we're not going to agree with him on every point. But particularly, the reason I like his Torah commentaries is, and he calls it the rational Bible, right? Is that he doesn't go so far down the like hyper spiritual route that you're like, I don't know how we got from the words that are here to this really like mystical interpretation. He's much more practical of pulling out principles of, you know, this is how God wants to live. This is how it's informed the world. This is how it's even informed the Western world and things like that. And the benefit of, Judeo-Christian ethics and different things like that, and how that's helped, how that's impacted our country. If you don't know, Dennis Prager, he's fluent, I believe. Not sure how many languages, but one of them is Russian. He's studied Russian history quite a lot. He's a I don't know how you would consider him a scholar in Russian history, and so if you listen to him or read some of it, I haven't seen it as much here, but he does bring it up sometimes. But I used to listen to his weekly fireside chat, which was just, he would kind of sit and just talk about what's going on in the world. He would answer questions that people send in, different kinds of things. And he does a lot of comparison between, like how we see like things like communism and some of these different things and how damaging it is versus, countries that have a Jewish or Christian background and the ethics that come into that. And we've talked about some of that. So it's an interesting thing. So all that to say, I'm still recommending Prager. I'm also saying we have to remember who he is and the lens that he's coming from. And so that doesn't mean just because I'm recommending a commentary means I'm saying everything he says is right, which I don't think you guys think. And I know that you guys know we don't read most things saying we're going to agree with everything. There were a few times particularly where he really went that way in the commentary that I was noticing, and I was just like, I just wanted to bring that point up. Okay, so now into the portion. So this is our second portion in Deuteronomy. We start in Deuteronomy 3:23, and I also will say, I don't know how much we'll get into, how many sections we'll read, but at some point, I think somewhere in chapter 5, I think it is at one of those sections where the verse numbering in Jewish translations versus Christian translations is off a little bit. So just be aware, like if we say something and you're not seeing it in that verse, look one ahead or one behind, and you'll find us, because the numbering does happen, and I don't always remember to put that in my notes when they're different. So I kind of wanted to just, and really most of what I want to talk about is more along the lines of some themes, more so than particular verses. Though if there are particular sections that people want to talk about, please bring them up. I actually thought about doing kind of more of like a roundtable discussion for this portion versus this format, because there's so many good things to talk about. And a lot of the material in this is quite familiar to us. So that being said, I would love for us to have more of a conversation than me sit up here and talk, though you all know that I do also tend to get carried away when I get excited. So no promises that I won't talk too much.
People do.
So kind of we start out with really, so I would say in this portion overall, we have a lot of emphasis on keeping the commandments, right? Deuteronomy is a lot of recounting the journey through the wilderness, what has happened at Sinai. We see that, particularly in this portion, we see this, and the importance, and Moses is really, really focused on kind of exhorting them as they're about to go forth. Like, he knows he doesn't get to go with them. We've already had kind of the commissioning of Joshua, so we know who the next leader is going to be. We know that this generation is going to get to go in and take the land. And really there's a lot of emphasis on the commandments and why they need to keep them, which is something that I want us to talk about. And also the importance of remembering, which is a theme throughout the whole Torah, right? We have this, like, you must remember so that, and there's a lot of that in this portion as well as the 10 words and the Shema. So it's a packed portion. It's full of a lot of really significant things. And as I was reading, it was making me think of something from the New Covenant scriptures as well. So hopefully we end up getting there. That's my goal. So what I really want us to start out talking about is kind of this theme of this exhortation to keep the commandments, which we see kind of throughout the portion, right? And kind of the question that we have about this is this unto what? Why is Moses so focused on saying you need to keep the commandments? It's important that you do these things. It's important that you remember. It's important that you live this way. Why is he so focused on that?
Well, God gave him those commandments to give to the people so they could, even though the commandments, how do I phrase this? For mankind to keep all those commandments is almost an impossibility because we're so imperfect.
Sure.
But to strive to achieve obeying all those commandments is something that we're meant to do our best at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
seen them forget
He's seen them forget. Yeah,
already,
for sure.
and their tendency,
Yeah.
our tendency.
Mm-hmm.
I would say too that even it says in verse, well, it's in chapter 4, that it may go well with you,
Mm-hmm.
with you and your children, that you may, with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land which the Lord your God is giving you.
Mm-hmm.
So he knows it's our safe protection, it's the boundary, still to this day.
Mhm.
Those are our boundaries that we need to stay within.
Mm-hmm.
I, looking at it this way, they're getting ready to enter into this land. I mean, he's reiterating this. So the Lord has this land that he's promised to these people. He wants them to dwell in this land. And it will always be their land, but in order for them to be in it,
Right.
they have to, and in order for him to dwell with them in it, there's these relationship guidelines that are being established and behavioral guidelines that are being established, and how to love God and love neighbor in this land so they can dwell in this land. I mean, yes, he wants them to be decent human beings wherever they're at, but if you want to stay in this land and if you want the Lord's presence to stay in this land with you, this is what needs to be done. And you start worshiping other gods, you start doing other things, you start mingling in there, and you don't follow these guidelines, you're not the holy people
Mm-hmm.
that he's called you to be. You're not the representatives that he's called you to be. They are supposed to be set apart so they can be that holy priest, that holy nation.
Right.
They have to look different.
Yes.
And so this is kind of like the sign of this is what you guys are supposed to look like so that you're representing me and you can be those priests between me and the nation, just the same way Moses was the priest between him and the people.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't look like the rest of the nations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think all of these things are really
Mhm.
good. There's a lot to this. And I think, kind of just going off of what you were just saying, Lori, is that I was kind of noticing as I was reading through even in Deuteronomy 4:6, he's talking about the commandments, and he's exhorting the people to keep them just as he's taught them. And in verse 6 it says, "You must keep and do them, for it is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that the gods so near to them, that has God so near to them as Adonai our God is whenever we call on him? What great nation is there that has statutes and ordinances that are righteous like all this Torah that I'm setting before you today?" And so it's this, we have to, the Lord has really been emphasizing this to me recently, partially because of some things I've been doing with Grafted, but of this idea that we have to remember that the calling of Israel is to be a light to the nations, right? Like that's what he's saying, is like the nations are supposed to see that you have this righteousness that they don't have. That they have all these gods, they're worshiping all these idols, but they're not near to them. They're not in relationship. They're trying to please them so that things can go their own, like go well or whatever. But they're kind of negotiating, whereas God's like, I want to dwell with you, and there's this particular type of righteousness that Israel is supposed to display that draws the nations. And even Dennis, which I think this is one of the things I like about Dennis Prager, is he's like, the point was that that people would want to serve the God of Israel, which doesn't mean that they're all supposed to be Jewish, but that they're supposed to, that all are have always been welcome to come and worship God. And And so there's, even from this outside, like there's this calling of Israel. The core calling of Israel is to be a light to the nations. And what's the calling of the nations in a new covenant context?
To make these men known? I mean, what do you mean, calling them?
Provoke the Jews to
To
jealousy.
provoke the Jews to
Oh,
jealousy.
okay.
So the nations are supposed to be a light the Jewish people are supposed to be a light to the nations. The nations are supposed to provoke Israel to jealousy. And unto what? Unto everyone worshiping the Lord. Do you have a comment, question?
Question. What makes a god a false god? We hear the other gods, other gods are acknowledged, but are gods and false gods two different things, or are they the same thing? So
I mean-
why do they use the term false sometimes and not all the time?
Sure. I mean, as far as I would say, whenever we're talking about any god that's not the God of Israel, it is a false god.
Okay.
Why they don't designate that? So, and this is being picky. As you're reading through, the small g this is not the God of Israel,
Yes.
and therefore a false
Yes.
god. But it doesn't always put the word false in there. But and this is an interesting thing too, and this goes back to the ancient context that we're reading in. And so, because there are some who were like, there are some arguments about Scripture and or even about God in general that it's like, how can he really be God? Like it's not like, how can you, like, it's not like the Bible is not really monotheistic because it talks about these other gods, is one of the arguments about the Bible, which is really interesting. But in an ancient context, anything and everything could be a god, and I would say in modern context that's somewhat true as well, but that maybe is not fully what we need to talk about right now. But this whole idea of that people assign spiritual power, and there is spiritual power to other things other than God, right? Like we have the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. There are evil spiritual beings, and they can manifest in different things. And so, and you could choose to worship those things. Dennis Prager somewhere, I don't remember what verse it was on, but he makes a comment that the what does he say? It was really interesting. He says something that basically like the consequence or the punishment of following a false god is that you're worshiping a false god, because it's like it's unsatisfying. It's never going to satisfy you. So, but the Bible is basically, so it's in this ancient context where all people are understood, like it's the assumed understanding that everybody's worshiping something or someone. And so but the point, and again I've mentioned this a couple different times, is that the part of the point of the Torah is to demonstrate that the God of Israel is categorically different than any other small g god. Which is why I think we have these like this passage where it talks about these other gods, because it's not to try to say, it's not turning a blind eye or having this like we're just going to ignore that people are worshiping other things. It's like, of course they are. But this God is categorically different and the real God and the creator of the universe. So I don't know that was actually an answer to your question, other than just a commentary about the reality of false gods. Yeah.
Well, and of course, Michael Heiser did The Unseen Realm,
Sure.
which is an excellent book about Elohims,
Right.
and spirits and principalities. And to me, I know they use the word false god. I would rather call it the wrong gods.
Sure.
And it's just basically where they've taken a principality or a spiritual being, they've exalted it to a place that it's not supposed to be, like we said, other type of things. Because, it's very clear in the Bible that there are principalities and powers and things that are out there. And when these nations decide to take something other than the one true God and exalt that as their God, which a lot of them are demonic, as we know, let's create an idol and let's call this one in instead. And that's where we run into that, and that's the territory that Israel's walking into now, where the peoples in these lands have decided to take something else, another principality, and make it God and worship it. So it's just, that's the debate on what are they worshiping?
So false god is basically an oxymoron?
The little gods, yeah. It's not really the God.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean so I also think it's in this conversation, because there are some who make the argument of just like, well, we don't even need to worry about false gods. They don't have any power because they're not God. And it's like, they are certainly not as powerful as God. However,
You definitely need to worry about it.
we need to be on guard against them, right? Because we know, like, we know the tendency of the human heart is unfortunately bent towards evil. Given enough time and enough temptation, most humans will go that way, unless you are actively pursuing God. Like, there's no such thing as like passive love of God, really. If you're not actively pursuing the Lord and actively pursuing living the way that He instructs, which I want to talk about in relation to these commandments, and pursuing, kingdom life, I would say, in the kingdom of light. If you're not actively pursuing that, then your tendency is going to be pulled toward evil. It's just, I think we have several thousand years of human history that demonstrates that fairly well. Faith, did you have something?
Well, a couple of things. Several times in this passage, or in this portion, I noted where he says, so watch yourselves.
Yes.
So watch yourselves,
Yes.
that you don't, so that you're not seduced
Right.
by, it's literally, the enemy in all his forms, to seduce the people of God away. And another, it's in 4:13, where it equates the Ten Commandments to the covenant.
Yes.
So he declared you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
And we even see this all the way through Revelation.
Yes.
The perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony
Yes.
of Yeshua.
Yeah, and we see, this is what I think is so interesting even about reading, like, what I have found in my life, the pattern that I've noticed over the last several years is that as I've read Torah specifically for the last, I don't know, I've been here 11 years. I can't say that I faithfully followed the Torah reading schedule all 11 years, but at least 8 of them, I will say. I try. Well, when I first came, I was like, what are we doing? I don't know what's going on, to be honest. But it has become a really important thing, and I knew the Lord asked me to do that. And it's like, and many of us who grew up in the church didn't really grow up reading Torah. And so I was like, well, I'm probably, if this is the foundation of God's word, maybe I need to spend some time. But I noticed after I got about 5 years in, it was more familiar, and then I started to notice that more and more I would see these principles in other aspects of Scripture. And so then the last couple of years, I felt like the Lord has asked me to commit to read the whole Bible each year for at least. And when he first told me, he was like, maybe 3 to 5 years. Okay, I actually think this is maybe the rest of my life. I think he just didn't say that because I would be like, really?
Overwhelmed.
My whole life? Not that I don't want to read the Bible my whole life, but reading, and I actually don't know that it's a read through the entire Bible in a year, but anyway, this is my whole thing with the Lord. But anyway, the whole point is, but what I've noticed, as I've been doing that for a couple of years, I'm almost through the second year of committing to reading through the Bible in a year. I think I'll continue to read through the whole Bible in some kind of cycle. I think it might just take me longer than a year because I might start digging into some different things. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, like, as I read through, I start to see how some of this plays out, right? Mm-hmm. Like, especially you read through the Kings, like you read through like Kings and Chronicles, and you read through all the, this was a righteous king who, because like we have commandments of the king is supposed to read, write his own Torah scroll, and reading to people, and the kings that did the things that the Torah says they're supposed to do, things go really well, and the kings that don't, it goes really badly. Like, we see this play out of the be careful to not forget. And again, going back to that kind of diligence I was talking about, if you're not actively pursuing the Lord, you just get pulled away. You know, especially, you know, like now there's so many things you can pay attention to. So anyway, so yeah, I think that this is really good. So I want to talk a little bit about what it means to follow the commandments, particularly in light of this, and in light of we'll just talk about our congregational reality, where we have Jew and Gentile worshiping together, and we obviously we place a lot of value on the Torah. We do believe the Torah is still relevant to us today, right? This is why we emphasize reading it so much. It's why we come here an hour and a half before service on Shabbat and talk about it, right? And so, but what does this mean? So does this mean, as maybe, you know, more than half the people in this room are Gentile, more than half the people in our congregation are Gentile? Last I knew, the percentage was roughly 20 to 30% Jewish, and the rest Gentile in our congregation. And that's looking at family units, where most of the couples in our congregation that are Jewish, most of the families we would consider Jewish in our congregation, it's an intermarried couple, which is true of most of the population of the Jewish world, because the Jewish people have been scattered, so there's been intermarriage through. But we would consider if one of the couple is Jewish, we consider that a Jewish family union for purposes of our congregation. So roughly 20 to 30% Jewish, the rest are Gentile. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the Gentile section of our congregation when it comes to the Torah and it comes to these instructions of keep these commandments? I have a vested interest in this conversation right now. I've been having this conversation in various forms a lot recently.
Well, I would say, you know, when you consider 600 plus commandments, they're not all relevant for every single person.
Sure.
Some are relevant to a certain tribe or priest,
Sure.
and all. But those that are relevant to us, I believe we keep.
Okay.
Jew or Gentile. There are those that apply.
Sure. And how do we know? But how do we know which ones are which?
Well, I'm a woman.
Sure.
The commandments concerning a Levitical priest in that day are not going to be applicable to me. I would say, one example I think of is the commandment to put a fence around your roof. If you live in, and they're all pointing to love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strengthen your neighbor as yourself.
Sure.
They're all boiling down to that.
Absolutely.
The reason to put a roof around your house in Israel would be because it's a flat roof.
Right.
And if you're entertaining, your
Right.
friends and neighbors can fall
Right.
off your roof.
Right.
I'm not gonna build a roof around my
Right.
a fence around my peaked roof
Right.
in Kansas City.
Because people aren't going to hang out on your roof.
It's not, it's not relevant.
We hope. Maybe
So-
your grandchildren are going to climb up there and do
Right,
something silly
right.
one day.
But I think there's principles there.
Sure.
You know, and don't move the boundary, and all these things that do apply to us.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
Of course, I'm gonna jump into the big one, circumcision.
There you go.
You know, the laws given, some are very specific to the Jewish people. And there are things like we do in this congregation, like we keep kosher when we come together for a meal.
Sure.
That is a solidarity, that is loving your neighbor by not putting something that's offensive out there for them or something that they're not supposed to eat. I could eat shrimp if I wanted to. I don't like it, so it's not
Sure.
an issue for me. You know, but there are laws that are very specific for the covenant that was made specifically to Israel. When we're joining together, when the Gentiles were coming in, most of this was like, you may not be required to do this, but if you're going to be in community with these people, which I think is what Paul and many of them were trying to get across, why are you doing things as offensive to these people or is a command that they're not supposed to do. That's not like if I go into somebody's house and, you know, overstep boundaries. Yeah, you know, go in, okay, like I don't do this, but let's say a person is a non-smoking household and they find smoking offensive. And I walk in and decide to light up a cigarette in their house, which that has happened to me, that somebody's come in there and do that. Why would you do that when
Right.
it's something that is either something they're commanded not to do or even like the drinking thing? You don't offer an alcoholic a drink. I mean, there's just things
Sure.
about loving neighbor.
Sure.
So I think a lot of this commandment things, even if it's not applied to me specifically, in order to be in community with somebody that it has been asked of them, there's got to be a way to mingle those two communities together and love on each other and not do things that's offensive.
Sure.
Or ask them to do something that they have been asked not to do.
Sure.
Which we've seen through history where they've, you know, if you're a Jew, but if you, unfortunately history has showed, prove that you're a Christian
Sure.
by eating pork.
Sure.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, we've seen the craziness of
Right.
that.
Yeah, and so what you're getting at is there's this idea of deference.
Yeah.
We tend to talk about deference
Mm-hmm.
in our congregation, and really, I mean, and we see this even in some of Paul's letter, and this is one thing I'll point out is that which this would apply both to the Torah, that this particular portion even that we're reading, as well as some of the New Covenant letters, is think about who they're writing to. Because who is Moses talking to? Is he talking to Gentiles right now? He's not. And even in the 10 words, who are the 10 words given to? The Jewish people. So that doesn't mean they don't have application to us. Like, especially, like, I mean,
Not kill.
right, it's like it doesn't mean, okay, so the Jewish people are not allowed to murder, everybody else it's whatever. It's not what that means. But because there is an understanding that there is kind of a universal code of ethics and level of morality, and that's kind of universally agreed upon. But there are some of these, like particularly Shabbat, and this is one of the things that Tom did his dissertation on Shabbat, and this is one of the things that he points out all the time, because there's, particularly in the Messianic / Jewish roots, Hebrew roots world, which, by the way, are not actually synonymous terms, which is at the, I'll explain myself here in a minute, which is kind of at the root of why I'm being so particular about this. Because that people are like, people come in the Messianic world and it's like, the church is wrong, they're not keeping the 7th-day Sabbath. It's not, we need to not think that. Because the keeping of the Sabbath is a commitment to Israel. It's a sign of God's covenant with Israel. Now, as Gentiles in a Messianic community, we, those of us who are Gentile, are observing a 7th-day Sabbath in support, and again, coming alongside our Jewish brothers and sisters in Messiah, and it's this way to bring unity. But that does not mean that churches who worship on Sunday are wrong. And Tom does a really great job, but he can explain it better than I can because he's done all the research and has all the things. But he makes this really interesting point. I was just talking to him about this within the last few months even, of the fact that, because the reason that Christians started worshiping on Sunday is to celebrate the resurrection. And it was this part of keeping, it was a weekly celebration of resurrection, and it was worshiping God, and it was this set apart day. Some of that has been lost over time, that now it's like, yes, service maybe on Sunday, but then you go do whatever else you need to. It's not necessarily this day of rest. But there is still this principle of this set apart day to come together and worship the Lord. And it's okay that Gentile churches are worshiping on Sunday. So all that to say, so my point with some of this is that it's talking about, Moses is so emphatic about keeping the commandments in this portion, and so, and about the 10 words and the covenantal reality of the 10 words and all these different things, But he's giving that to the Jewish people. Again, that doesn't mean there's no application to Gentiles, particularly Gentiles who align themselves with Israel in some way. But it doesn't mean, what I'm getting at is we're not saying that Gentiles who believe in Yeshua are required to keep all the laws of the Torah, right? Going back to what Faith was talking about, there are different laws for different people, and even as we go through the Torah, there are instructions to the outsider in your midst, the alien in your midst, whatever, different translations, and there's some different wordings throughout there. The stranger among you, that kind of language is talking about people from other nations who are coming to worship the Lord, and they're not required to take on all of the Torah. So it is becoming, and this is why I make the distinction between Messianic as we understand it and we are trying to live out, and some of the Hebrew roots movements that are very popular, is this one law reality that it's like we're all supposed to do all the commandments of the Torah, and that's not what God is getting at. I've spent the last month responding to a lot of these conversations, so it's very important to me right now. But I mean, it's always important, but you know what I mean? Because I think there's this tendency, but what happens is people read portions like this, or people start to see the beauty in Jewish tradition, and even we can talk about here in a minute, even of just this talk about remembering and teaching, like and a lot of Jewish practice is based on remembering, right? Even the Passover Seder is probably the easiest example, because it's this retelling of the Exodus story, and it's unto what? So that they remember, so that the story is passed down from generation to generation, so that every generation recognizes the deliverance of the Lord for the Jewish people. And so we start to see all that beauty, and then people are like, well, I want to do all of that. And so you start going on, and honestly, it's easier. It's much easier if you say, well, do everything the Torah says. That's much easier than going through and saying, like, okay, who are they talking to? Who am I in this story? What is the Lord actually asking of me? And we have to do some work here, right, between the Torah and how even what is instructed in some of the New Covenant scriptures, Acts 15, Galatians 2, all these different things.
And that requires relationship.
It requires relationship.
Yeah.
It does.
And I was going to say too, I think we do have to be careful, because when the Holy Spirit himself is drawing someone to walk in a level of greater obedience to keep the Shabbat, that can be not just an issue of, oh, I kind of like what they're doing, I think I'll do it.
Sure.
But actually the drawing of the
Sure.
Spirit. The other thing I would say, probably beyond what you want to get into at this right now, but what do you say about, in Ephesians, when Paul is saying, therefore remember that formerly you the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and salvation. It just goes on to say, you were strangers and aliens, but you're no longer strangers and aliens. It's the whole grafted in, and co-heirs and all of that. I just think that's a part of the grand issue of our salvation that bears paying attention to, I guess.
And what Paul is saying there is a lot of what Paul is saying in a lot of these letters when he uses language like this is that you're no longer separated, or even the language of there, in Messiah there's no longer Jew, Gentile, man, woman, slave, free, all these different things. He's not saying that distinction goes away.
Right.
He's saying that if you are under, through the blood of Yeshua, we can all covenantally be part of the family. And there's no status difference. It's not like, well, if you're Jewish, you're up here. If you're Gentile, it's like, yeah, you're part of the family, but you're down here. And there's somehow partially because we have very hierarchical minds, typically. They have a very Greek way of thinking, which is not all bad even, but it tends to be like, The more you do, the better you are, which then what leads you to the thinking of like, well, the more of these commandments I take on, the better I am, the more I can start to climb up to that level, right? And that's not how what I'm saying is I don't think that's how God is, what he's trying to communicate to us through Paul in those letters is that's not how God sees us. It's like if you come into the covenant through Yeshua, he loves you and you're part of the family and you are called to righteousness. You are called to living your life a certain way, but that doesn't mean if you're Gentile that you're called to take on all the commandments of the Torah. In the same way that if you're Jewish, it doesn't mean that you throw off all of the commandments. There's still distinction. Like, I mean, Tom always uses the example of like, you know, because it says, you know, he says in one of the other letters of just like, there's no longer man or woman. It's like, but we still know that there are men and women, right? But it's not that there's no distinction. It's that the distinction doesn't create a hierarchy, if that makes sense.
We like measuring sticks.
We do. And so that's why we have to constantly be through relationship, right? That's why we live this out together so that we can figure this out together and with the Lord. He gave us the Holy Spirit so that we can figure out how to live this out and have these distinctions, so we can have this difference. And even we were talking about some of the difference of like as Gentiles, you know, like when we have, you know, like we're gonna have oneg next week. We're not gonna have pulled pork and shellfish and all kinds of things, you know, like we're gonna have difference to our Jewish members, that we're gonna have a meal that's biblically kosher. We're not going to chase the rabbinical kosher rabbit right now, because we hold a biblical kosher view here. But that doesn't mean that the Gentile that goes out and has lunch during the week and has a bacon cheeseburger is sinning. Like, you know, like we have to just keep everything in perspective. Is my point. Yeah.
And even with on that same line with this coming together as a community, I mean, this last week and on to next week also shows the beauty of we had a Gentile young man have his bar Yeshua, and we're going to have a Jewish young man have his bar mitzvah.
Right.
We're basically celebrating them kind of the same way.
Right.
But we're still showing that unity with the distinction that this is a Gentile and this is a Jewish man, but they're both committing their lives to Yeshua. You know, and so I think there's like this beauty in looking at the fact that we're acknowledging there's a distinction, but we're still celebrating it unified together. Sure. And even with a lot of the laws that the Jewish people are being given in this on how to treat the stranger, the outsider, because they're learning too, you're not treating them like a subhuman. Right. You may have been treated like a subhuman when you were a slave, but now you're my people who are carrying my name.
Right.
I love these people, and you're going to treat them with a level of dignity and respect. And so I think this is, when people come out of captivity and they've learned this is what we do to people less than us from how they've been treated. And we've seen that in nations that get, I mean, I could think of specific ones where they overthrow their captors and then they come in and they're just as ruthless as the people that they overthrew. The Lord's making sure this doesn't happen.
Right.
You guys are my people, and you're not going to treat people the way you've been treated.
Right. And so to kind of just pull that thread even a little further is this is kind of where I want to go, and I sidetracked myself, is that, you know, we talked about the Gentile deference to the Jewish people. There's also a Jewish deference to Gentiles. And this is part of what we call the Antioch incident in Galatians 2, where Paul's calling out Peter because it's this whole eating with Gentiles things, right? Where he's like, you were eating with Gentiles, and then these other people from Jerusalem come and you stopped. Like, what was that saying? And it's the point, I think, is Paul's trying to bring some conviction of like, remember, we just had this whole thing, because this is probably happening kind of about the same time some of the things in Acts. And of course, we talked about a lot here, this story in Acts 10 with Peter and all the unclean animals on the sheet, that it's not about food, right? Like, people really like to use Acts 10 to say, oh, kosher went away. And it's like, that's not what happened there. That's why Peter keeps saying, like, Lord, what are you talking about? And that's why we use Tom, as Tom says, one of our hermeneutic principles is keep reading, right? Is that, and that's why, it defines him, and that's why he's willing to go to Cornelius' house, because Jewish people didn't enter Gentile homes because Gentiles were unclean. And again, we've had conversations also that unclean doesn't mean sin, but it has to do with life in the temple and different things like that. But he's saying that, but the whole point was the Lord was revealing to Peter that Gentiles are not unclean. You can go into their houses. You can even eat with them. You may not eat the same food. As a Jewish person, you actually may have brought your own food to dinner at your Gentile friend's house. Doesn't mean you can't sit at the table together. Because that was the point, right? Like life happens around the table.
Yeah.
Like, we've all experienced that. Like, you share a meal with someone, and you tend to get to know them much better than if you just, are doing something else. And so, like, there's something about table fellowship that's really significant. And that's what then, Paul's calling Peter out on, and he's like, hey, you are the one who got this download, that you can hang out with Gentiles, and then all of a sudden these people from Jerusalem show up, and you're, like, not eating with them. It's like, what are you doing? Right? And so there's this, like, so I'm saying that to kind of bring the other side, too, of, like, Jewish people can hang out with Gentiles. And we don't have that issue so much, like, because of the world we live in now. But hopefully you get my point, is that there is deference from both sides, and yet there's also calling on both sides. So I want to shift us a little bit into a couple other things that I thought were really interesting about this portion that I wanted to show up, because it's another theme I was seeing as I was reading through, and that Dennis Prager brings out in his commentary that I thought was really interesting. So there's kind of this tension or these themes about the fear of the Lord and loving God. And so I thought this was really interesting. I didn't know this. And I'm taking Dennis Prager at his word that he's done his homework. He knows way more Hebrew than I do. So I believe him. So in Deuteronomy 4:10, we mentioned this verse a little bit in passing. So I'm going to back up, actually. I'm going to read 9 and 10. Partially just because I love this. I love verse 9. Only be watchful and watch over your soul closely, so you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, and they slip from your heart all the days of your life. You are to make them known to your children and your children's children. The day that you stood before Adonai your God in Horeb, Adonai said to me, gather the people to me, and I will make them hear my words, so that they learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and so that they teach their children. So this so that they learn to fear me is really interesting. So the word in Hebrew that's translated fear is used a lot throughout the Torah, really. Like, there's a lot of references to fearing the Lord, right? So what I found was interesting is, like, the translation that Prager uses in his commentary, which is not, Prager didn't translate it. It's a really common Jewish translation. I don't remember. It's the JPS translation. Yeah, I was like, I can't remember what it is now. It's the 1985 JPS translation. But his translation that he's using, and this is why he makes a point about this, says that in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on the earth. And he goes into this really interesting discussion of, like, that people don't like the idea of fearing the Lord. Like, people really struggle with that concept of fearing the Lord. And but what I think is really interesting about this word is that, and there's another use of it even in this portion. We'll get there in a second. But this is the same word for fear that is back in Exodus 1, when it talks about the midwives, that Pharaoh has instructed that all the Hebrew babies, the boys, are all supposed to be killed, right? And the midwives don't. Why? Because they fear the Lord. And so it's this same word, and there it does use fear. So it's interesting. So, and so Prager has this really interesting thing. I was just like, I don't know why we don't say this, but TLV does say fear. And so it's this. So he's suggesting that people have a hard time with this idea of fearing the Lord. It's also used in this portion in Deuteronomy 6:2, which is right before the Shema. And it's talking about all the. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and ordinances that Adonai your God commanded to teach you to do in the land you're crossing over to possess, so that you might fear Adonai your God, to keep all his statutes and mitzvot I am commanding you, and your son and your son's son all the days of your life, so that you may prolong your days, and so on. So it's this interesting, the keeping of the commandments is so that, and the remembering is so that you fear the Lord. And then, particularly with this instance, and this is what I think is really interesting. I liked this tension a little bit. So they're talking about the fear of the Lord and remembering and keeping the commandments. And then it goes into the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love Adonai your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And goes on in the Behafta and so forth and everything. But so Prager points out this really interesting dynamic of we're instructed to fear the Lord and to love the Lord. But the fear of the Lord doesn't have the same. I want to find what he said because I really liked how he said it. Because he talks about, Prager also has this wrestle with loving God. He's like, sometimes God is not very lovable. And I was really interesting when he started out. I had to keep reading. I had to keep reading. I had to use the keep reading principle with Prager. I was like, I don't know that I'm with you. But he talks about, he's coming from a Jewish perspective of thinking about Jewish history and all the things that have happened to the Jewish people. It's like, how can a loving God allow things like the Holocaust? And that's just a more recent example, right? We just had Tish B'Av this week. And if you don't know, we had the destruction of both temples on Tish B'Av, and throughout history, Tom has the list. And if some of you have taken the Grafted U course, it's on the Grafted U resources. Of all these events throughout history, there's events that in World War I started on Tish B'Av. The final solution was presented in World War II on Tish B'Av. There's different things regarding different things, really terrible things in Jewish history have all happened on the same date on the Jewish calendar, which is really interesting. So Dennis Prager is coming from this perspective of how am I supposed to love a God that lets all this happen? Which is an interesting thing, and he brings out the point of the meaning of the name Israel is to wrestle with God. And so he makes the point of part of Jewish identity is wrestling with God, and I think part of all of our identity really is wrestling with God, and I think that's a good thing. And I don't think doubt is wrong. I don't think asking questions is wrong. I don't think frustration with not understanding why things are happening is wrong. But he comes back to the point of this commandment to love, and he says somewhere in one of his essays, he's just it's something I'm still working on. He's like, I've made it a goal to love God, and I'm still working on it. I think it's really funny. But it's this process, this relational process, right, is really what he's getting at. He's not using that term, but that's really what he's getting at, is that there's this relational process of partnering with the Lord that helps us with that whole issue of loving God. But what he says about this, and when he's talking about this dynamic of fearing God and loving God, because we're commanded to do both, but he says it's worth noting that for all the significance of fearing God, the Torah does not command us to fear God the same way it commands us to love him. We are not told to fear God with all our heart, soul, and might. He says, for one thing, such an all-encompassing fear would paralyze us. For another, fear of God comes more naturally than love of God. Even pagans feared their gods. That's why they sacrificed human beings to them. It's that's a really interesting thing. So we talk about how difficult, like, we have, like, I feel like we've almost flipped in this. Like, we have difficulty with this fear of God thing, because we have emphasized in Christianity the love of God so much, the grace of God, the love of God. And he's suggesting that, like, fear of God is actually more natural. If you recognize the power of God, it's more natural to fear him than to love him. But he's suggesting through the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Or mind is added in the New Covenant, but it's implied here in Hebrew. But that, the love of God is, like, loving God is supposed to be with all of our being. All of our being is supposed to go into that. So I just think that's a really interesting tension that was kind of brought out. So I'd be interested if anybody has any other thoughts about that. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Whoever.
Go ahead, Mike.
Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord, the fear of Adonai is the beginning of knowledge. And I've known that for all.
Sure.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
Yeah.
We've got notes in here that really says the awe of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And awe is a sense of wonder inspired by God's presence. Unlike fear, awe encourages love, joy, and drawing near.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think of that word fear, I think awe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it puts a whole different dimension on it.
Yeah, which could even play into part of why some
Makes
of
more
the
sense.
translators in these couple verses that I was bringing out translated that word as revere instead of fear, because there is there's this awe and drawing, and yet I would still say there's something to this, and I think maybe reverence is a better, and I think awe can play into it too, of like, he is the all-powerful God. We need to have some respect for that power. Go ahead.
Yeah, amen to all that, because I think that somewhere along the line I looked up the word fear too, in the Hebrew, and it is that reverence. I mean, that holy, like, acknowledging he's the righteous judge, and he brings righteous judgment. So, therefore, stay close to him and in that protective place with him. I was going to say, and something else comes to mind. Yeshua says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but afterwards have no power to cast the soul into hell, but fear the one who has the authority to cast both into hell." So, in other words, stay close to me so that I don't have to bring my judgment.
Right.
The only other thing I was going to say is that in Jeremiah, when Jeremiah is prophesying about the new covenant to come, and I think this is the beauty of what Yeshua did. I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from them to do them good, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, so that they will not turn away from me. So it's like out of his love, we have that holy, right fear and reverence of the Lord.
Same way you should fear your
Yeah.
mother.
Yeah.
Right.
Respect.
Yes, there's a level of respect to it, right? It's good. It's really good. Go ahead.
Just on this fear thing, in chapter 5, before we get down to 6, where they're talking about the fear of the Lord, the people's response to hearing the Lord's voice and from the mountain, and it says, then you said, Adonai your God has just shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and yet he keeps on living. So they're like that, he's here and we're still alive. And then it drops down and it says, Adonai heard the tone of your words when you spoke to me. And Adonai said to me, I've heard the tone of the words that these people have spoken to you. and they've done well in all they've spoken.
Mhm.
If only there was such a heart in them to fear me
Mhm.
and keep all my mitzvahs always, so that it might go well with them and with their children forever.
Right.
But that if only, so I mean, that's like this longing on the Lord's heart, that there was that in them, so that it would go well with them, but so it would go well with their kids, so that the Lord could have them live the fullest of the promises in the land. His heart, I mean, I just feel like if that little phrase there, if only, because that's really his desire. Fear me so that you don't stray off, and everything I want to give you can be yours.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because so it's kind of pointing out, and it's, oh, it was earlier. I was trying to remember who was in this, because there's like these two recounting passages of Sinai in this portion. One was in chapter 4, and then we have this one in chapter 5. And the one in chapter 4 is when Moses kind of digresses into his whole, like, because of you, I don't get to go in the land.
Yeah.
It's like, well, okay.
Yes,
Anyway.
no.
Yeah, but whatever. Anyway, we don't go there, but it is really interesting, and it's kind of just this whole, like, he has this moment of this, like, I don't get to go in. Anyway, but yeah, in this one, yeah, it's this talking about, so it's kind of pointing out, like, they do have this element of this fear, this reverence, that they're like, we can't be that close to the presence, really. And he says that that's a good thing, but then if only your heart were, but there's also this mixture, because of course what happens in the midst of this Sinai is that's why Moses has to do it twice, right? Is they come down, and he comes down and they've built this idol, and it's like, no, like, didn't we just talk about this?
Do you feel like this passage kind of shows, like, they had the head knowledge, they saw it, but obviously it isn't, they saw it and they communicated what they saw correctly, but obviously it hasn't gotten down into their heart where there's a literal fear of the Lord. I mean, they know, it just seems to me like there's like this head knowledge, heart knowledge thing going on this.
Yeah, I think there's some element of that, because I think also, I think a part of that is that it's because, again, it's like this one of the underlying themes of this whole portion is passing it on, right? Is this continued, like, you have to pass it on, because remember, this is actually kind of being recounted to the second generation that wasn't really there, where they were very small children, right? And so I think there's this element that every generation kind of has to have the revelation.
Yeah.
That it's not enough it's actually not enough that your family knew and experienced and knew this truth. It's that you have to know it too, right? And we see that in families now, like, right? Like, it's like, I feel like, I've experienced this in my own life. I don't have my own children to see this, but I've watched it happen in other families. It's like you get to a point where your children have to make their own choices, and you hope that you've raised them, that they love the Lord and they continue in that. And sometimes they go away for a while and come back to the Lord, whatever. But it's this whole, like, but the point is, the common theme is, even if they don't have a season of kind of straying away, like, it still has to become their own. Like, right? You like, the faith of your parents doesn't carry you forever. At some point, it has to become your own. And I think that that's part of this too, and that's part of why they have the reminder to remember, to keep the commandments, and because and going back on this, and then I want to jump to a new covenant connection, another one here in just a second for our last couple minutes, is that's why it's not whether, and this applies for Jewish tradition, it applies for Christian tradition, and whatever mixture you may have, or whatever tradition you may have, is that it's actually it's not enough to just do the thing. right? It's like, that's why there's all this talk about, like, you have to explain to your children. And it even talks about, like, this is why it talks about them telling your story. Like, back down in 6:20, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what are the testimonies and the statutes and the ordinances that Adonai your God commanded you? It's not, the response then is not, well, you're supposed to teach them to do this and this and this and this. It says, you are to tell your son, we were slaves to Pharaoh. And Adonai brought us out. Before our eyes, he showed signs and wonders. You're supposed to tell us all these things. So it's not, the question is, what are the statutes and ordinances? The response is the story, right? So it's not enough to pass on the traditions. It matters that you internalize the history and the why behind it, and that your heart, that then you do the things, the ritual things, which are good things. Like, we do, like, we're designed to learn and remember by engaging in practice, right? That's what a ritual is. And so it's not that we're not supposed to do the things, it's we're supposed to know why we're doing them, right? Which is why it's that your heart matters. And it's not enough, and Dennis Prager talks about this too, I loved it, because it said before the 10 words, it says you're supposed to learn these things and observe them faithfully. And he even says, like, doing a ritual for just the God said so reason is not actually good enough. It's like your heart has to be engaged with it, which we would say, there has to be relationship. And it's also why, some of these rituals still carry so much meaning, even in a new covenant reality, is because it still is engaging us with a part of the heart of the Lord. And so it comes back to this, I always come back to this, like, this unto what? Even like as I came into the Messianic movement as a Gentile, and of course we celebrate the feast because it's this deference to God commands Israel, the Jewish people, to keep these feasts, and we have Jewish people in our congregation, so we are celebrating alongside the Jewish people is really what we're doing. But even as I was starting to come into that, and I was starting to, think about, what kinds of things do I even do in my own home? And the Lord would bring up this unto what kind of question of, like, am I doing this? Like, counting Omer is one that I've talked with the Lord. Like, sometimes I count the Omer at home and sometimes I don't, honestly. Like, because one time when he was like, well, I'm part of this congregation, I have to do it. And the Lord's like, why are you doing it? And I was like, because I'm supposed to. He's like, that's not a good reason. I'm just saying, like, the Lord gave me a heart check of just like, if this is drawing you closer to me, you can do it. And so then one year I was like feeling this intercessory burden for Israel through it, and counting the Omer was part of this intercession. I had a prayer that I would pray, basically, praying for the salvation of Israel as I was counting the Omer, and the Lord's like, that you can do. Like, it's drawing me closer to the Lord and it's connecting me in with it. But just the doing it because you're supposed to do it was not okay. In that sense. Does that make sense? It's like, because
Perfect sense. Thank you.
So it's like, I'm just saying, like, that's part of even this maintaining distinction, even in a Messianic community, of just the like, what do I know why I'm doing this?
I would say too, if we can grab hold of it, it's all pointing to Yeshua.
Exactly.
And as we do it as believers, he is going to impart more of himself, like what he did at Passover,
Yeah.
or that counting down to the giving of the Spirit and all of that. So,
Mhm.
yeah, there's great relevance. in
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go, and this is what I want to end on. And so is that as I've been thinking about this, and as I've been answering questions and responding to questions about, what commandments are we supposed to keep as Gentiles, and what does how do we wrestle through all of these things? Is that comes back? What it comes down to is, what is the goal? What is the point of the Torah? The point of the Torah is not that we do all these things, right? The point of the Torah is not that we know how to do Passover. The point of the Torah is not that we know, that Jewish people know that they're supposed to wear tzitzit. The point of the Torah is none of that. What is the goal of the Torah? Yeshua. Romans 10:1. This verse, like, this passage has been really significant lately, is that this is Paul saying, brothers and sisters, My heart's desire and my prayer to God for Israel is for their salvation. For I testify about them, knowing that they have zeal for God, but not based on knowledge. For being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit themselves to the righteousness of God. For Messiah is the goal of the Torah, as a means of righteousness for everyone who keeps trusting. So the entire point of the Torah is to point to Yeshua. So, what I'm saying is, and what I was sort of trying to demonstrate through even some of my example of with Omer, was that if observing anything in Torah doesn't point us to Messiah, we need to talk to the Lord about it. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, is that, as we get, I don't want us to be so weighed down in what the keeping of the commandments is. And I'm not saying commandments aren't important. I'm not saying that Jewish identity markers are not important. I'm not saying that we don't apply Torah to our lives, but I'm saying that if we lose sight of the fact that the whole point of the Torah is to point us to Yeshua, then we're missing something. So it is 9:45, so we need to wrap up. So thank you all for this, just for joining me in this discussion this morning on all of this. So I am gonna close this in prayer real quick, and then we can be dismissed. So Lord, we do thank you that you are the goal of the Torah. We thank you that you are revealed in the Torah, that you are present with your people throughout the giving of the Torah, Lord. We thank you that you are. We just thank you for who you are, Lord. We thank you that you constantly draw us closer to you, Lord. I do just ask that you would help us to always keep that in mind as we're wrestling through, whether we're in a Messianic congregation or not, Lord, that as we look at what we're supposed to do as we worship you, and what commandments and what patterns we're supposed to implement in our lives, Lord, that we would look to you, Lord, and say, is this drawing us closer to you, Lord? And is it part of our, as Gentile, for the Gentiles in the room and the congregation, is it drawing us even into this partnership with you for your desire for the salvation of Israel, Lord? So we thank you, Lord, that you have made a way to bring us together, that we can have fellowship together, that we can worship you together, Lord, and we don't lose our distinctions, but we are still all part of your family, Lord. And Lord, we just ask that you would continue to teach us how we bring more of your kingdom to earth, Lord, and how to live our lives to represent you well, Lord, so that we can bring more people into your family, Lord, as we wait for you to return, Lord. So I do just ask that your presence would be with us in service, Lord. Ask that you would be with each person who is leading or facilitating a part of the service, or working with children, or whatever they're doing today, Lord. I just ask that your presence would be with each person who comes in, and that you would just help us to look to you and just delight in worshiping you today, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua.